Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Holcomb. I'm a curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters, and my colleague Barbara Boehm and I organized the installation of the Washington Haggadah, Medieval Jewish Art in Context. It's on view in the Fleischmann Gallery for Late Medieval Art here in the main building. And we want to welcome you all here today for what's going to be a marvelous program in conjunction with that installation. Out in the blogosphere, where there's a great deal of wisdom, I think, someone who has been following our endeavors to show Jewish art here in the medieval department recently posed a very astute question. What's a great encyclopedic museum like the Met to do when a group pretty much got left out of the encyclopedia? She's referring to the fact that we don't have a great deal of Jewish art here on view, and in our defense, I will say that Jewish art from the Middle Ages is exceedingly rare, and the history of how and why those rarities end up where they do is often a fascinating and complicated story. I think we're going to be hearing some of those stories today. But in direct response to that very practical question, I can respond that we work in partnership with others. So we are here today to celebrate our recent partnership with the Library of Congress, which has so generously lent to us the Washington Haggadah. It will be here for 3 months in Gallery 307, if you like to use the map, alongside related objects from our collection. I should add that the library is generously allowing us to turn the pages during the time that it is here. So you should come back again and again, for we'll have a new view each month. The Haggadah's presence here is both a continuation of and a departure from some of the work we have been doing here at the Met to represent Jewish artistic heritage from the Middle Ages. We have for several years now partnered with the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary to display medieval manuscripts from their extraordinary collection. We will continue to do that, and the next manuscript from the JTS Library will be installed next week. Here's a little preview of it in the medieval galleries. It's a great. We're very amused and kind of love this case because we often have to clean it. In fact, we have to clean it more than any other case because there's so many nose prints on it from people wanting to get as close as possible to see it. So that's a great thrill on the curatorial side. It's a Bible. This next work is a Bible decorated with micrography, that great feat of calligraphy at which so many Jewish scribes excelled, and which pictures are literally drawn with words. So again, you must come at the end of the week to see that marvelous work. But then, thanks to the support of the Berg Foundation, we are embarking on a parallel initiative to bring monuments of Hebrew manuscript illumination to the Met. These will be from outside of the New York area, and they will be in our galleries at intervals over the next 3 years. The Washington Haggadah is the first in that series. The Washington Haggadah was, of course, a luxury manuscript, and that did not preclude, though, its use at the Seder table for centuries. And I should add that it need not preclude its use at the Seder table today. Harvard University Press has recently published a beautiful and affordable facsimile of this manuscript. It's in our shop, and the facsimile is accompanied by 2 fascinating essays. So it is a great honor today to have the esteemed authors of those essays here today to speak to us. Before I introduce our speakers, there are a few people I need to thank. Many people work together to bring about installations such as these. Sharmila Sin and Phoebe Gilman at the Harvard University Press, and the staff at the Library of Congress, most especially Tambra Johnson and Yasmin Khan, were instrumental in bringing about this loan. There are too many names to mention of folks here at the Met who have helped us. If you're in the audience, you know who you are, but I do want to call attention to Joseph Lowe and his staff in the Education Department for helping to organize today's lecture. And then one more note, you can see that we're using captions today, and that will be for our first lecture only. There will be a very short break between the two lectures, not even long enough for you to go out to the bathroom or even to go out and view the manuscript. So sit tight, just stand and stretch your legs, and then we'll move on to the second lecture. Our first speaker today is David Stern. He is the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of Classical Hebrew Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he served for many years as the director of the Jewish Studies program. Educated at Columbia College and Harvard University, he's also taught at Princeton University, the University of Judaism in Los Angeles, the Hebrew University, and the University of Washington. He's received numerous awards and fellowships, including those from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies. He is also a fellow at the American Academy of Jewish Research. Stern's field of specialization are classical Jewish literature and the history of the Jewish book. He is prolific, having published 8 books and countless essays and reviews for both scholarly and general audience publications. In 2007, he curated the critically acclaimed exhibit Chosen, Philadelphia's Great Hebraica at the Rosenbach Library and Museum in Philadelphia. He is currently working on 2 books about the history of the Jewish book. The first of these, The Jewish Library, 4 Jewish Classics and the Jewish Experience, will be published this year. The second book, Through the Pages of the Past, the Story of the Jewish Book, will be published in 2012. His talk today, coming in part from his essay in the facsimile, is The Washington Haggadah, The Life of a Jewish Book. Professor Stern.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today to be able to speak to you. As anyone who works with books knows, books are like people. They have lives, those lives have stories, and those stories extend even into the afterlives of books with the histories of their owners and readers. And if books are like people, Jewish books are like Jews. They have Jewish lives, and the story of those lives are Jewish stories, with tales of wanderings from one country to another, across continents and oceans, and with accounts of near destruction, and alas, more often than one would wish, of destruction too, but also of miraculous salvations, and above all, of survival. In one way or another, Jewish books inevitably reenact in their pages the lives of the Jews and Gentiles who have produced, owned, and studied them. In this talk today, I want to relate the life of one book, the Washington Haggadah, the remarkable manuscript, which, as we've just been told, is now on exhibit in this great museum, and a book whose facsimile we are also here to celebrate. The Washington Haggadah takes its name from its final home, the Library of Congress of the United States of America in Washington, D.C., which was the last destination in the lengthy journey that this volume has taken in the course of its life as a book. The title is a recent one. The formal beginning of the Haggadah's life is recorded in the book's colophon, the technical term for a paragraph usually found at the end of a manuscript which records its history of composition. The work was completed, and it is sufficient, and today is the 25th day of the month of Shvat in the year 238, according to the short enumeration in our calendar, January 29th, 1478, the word of the least of the scribes, Joel, the son of Simeon, of blessed memory. Although Joel does not say where the Haggadah was produced, scholars have established the fact that Joel wrote it in Germany. In later centuries, it traveled to Italy, and then passing through a series of owners, the book was brought to America in circumstances that themselves bear remembering. And even in America, the Haggadah has not completely rested. It has traveled across this country in different exhibitions, and now, as you've heard, it's visiting New York. The life of the Washington Haggadah is not yet over. Now, the story of the Washington Haggadah, like that of every Passover Haggadah, began much earlier than the moment of its actual production. Strictly speaking, it began with the formulation of its text, a process that took at least 10 centuries, and that text itself derives from a ceremony, the Passover Seder, the ritual banquet held on the first nights of Passover. The Seder itself traces its origins back to the earliest beginnings of the Israelite nation with their exodus from Egypt. And the story of that exodus is told, of course, in the biblical book of Exodus. In tracing its history, then, one literally traverses nearly the entirety of Jewish history and the length of its literature. Within the limitations of this talk today, I don't have time to trace in detail the full history of the Haggadah, let alone that of the Seder. But a few facts about both are necessary in order to appreciate the Washington Haggadah story. While the roots of the Seder lie in the biblical injunction to offer the paschal sacrifice and eat it on the night following the 14th day of the month of Nisan, and after that to celebrate Chag HaMatzot, the festival of unleavened bread, for 7 days, and to explain to one's child the meaning of both rituals, the Seder as we know it did not emerge until late antiquity, in the centuries following the Common Era. Our earliest description of a Seder is found in the great rabbinic legal document edited in the early 3rd century, the Mishnah, in the tractate Psachim, chapter 10. And as one can deduce from other rabbinic works like the 2 Talmuds and the post-classical rabbinic texts, the Mishnah's Seder continued to evolve in the subsequent 6 or 7 centuries. Over this period, there came to exist at least 2 distinct versions of the Seder, one deriving from the Mishnah's text, which continued to be followed in Byzantine Palestine and its offshoots, the other a Babylonian revision of the earlier Palestinian Seder, which was practiced nearly everywhere else in the Jewish world. While the 2 versions were largely similar, there were some significant differences between them. For example, while the Babylonian Seder has the famous 4 questions, the Palestinian version had only 3. Eventually, the Palestinian version died out, and the Babylonian one became the near universal standard. Now, for these first 9 or 10 centuries of the Seder's history, there does not appear to have existed a Haggadah, that is to say, a written text for the Seder. The ceremony, with its various recitations, was still short enough that most people could learn it by heart, and they knew the sequence of ritual foods. Our earliest, near-complete copies of the Haggadah are 2 texts, both from Egypt and from the 11th century, that were preserved in the Cairo Geniza, and today are owned by the libraries of the University of Pennsylvania and the Jewish Theological Seminary. This image contains 1 leaf from Penn's copy. It's hard to see, but on the top of the page, you can just make out the beginning of the 3 questions. These early Haggadot actually still preserve the Palestinian version, probably right before its extinction. Indeed, these copies date from a period before the Haggadah had even become its own book. Originally, the Haggadah was copied as part of the Seder, the prayer book, and someone simply detached these pages from the prayer book, probably to use it at a Seder. And as you can see, these early Haggadot with their large, loopy script were very modest books. By the 13th century, probably first in Spain, known in Jewish tradition as Sfarad, and later in Germany and northern France, the territory known as Ashkenaz, the Haggadah had become a book in its own right. By the second half of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th, lavish, decorated, and illustrated Haggadot were also being produced in both centers. Now, the actual literary text of the Haggadah was remarkably similar in Ashkenaz and Sfarad, but the overall material shape of the Haggadah and its character as a book was significantly different. These differences can be seen in their structure and contents, as well as in their illustrational programs. In Sfarad, the Haggadah was almost a kind of mini holiday prayer book containing at its beginning and end the special prayers and liturgical poems, the piyutim, that were recited in synagogue on Passover. The illustrations in these Haggadot are mainly found in a series of miniatures typically located at the beginning of the Codex, and that retell the history of Israel, beginning either from the creation of the world or the birth of Moses, and concluding with pictures of contemporary Jews making preparations for the Seder. This image is from the series at the beginning of the famous Sarajevo Haggadah and depicts, on the right-hand page, the communal soup kitchen and distribution of matzot, and on the left-hand side, the family returning home from the synagogue after the evening prayers on the first night of Passover. The illustrations in these Haggadot were often done by Christian artists. The miniatures reflect the influence of French salters, and the quality of the illustrations is high and accomplished, even sophisticated. In contrast to the public communal nature of the Sephardic Haggadah, the Haggadah in Ashkenaz was very much a domestic book. It frequently begins with the ritual of searching for leaven, a ritual specifically performed within the privacy of the home, and almost never includes the synagogue prayers or poetry. In contrast to the Sephardic miniature sequences, the illustrations in the Ashkenazic Haggadot tend to be found largely in the margins of the Haggadah and typically relate to the Haggadah's text on the page and to the rituals performed on its page or to the biblical narrative of the exegesis. The page on the screen here is from the Bird's Head Haggadah, called this because all the Jewish figures in the Haggadah are depicted with the heads of birds. And this page records the parts of the Seder known as karpas, the hors d'oeuvres course of the Seder meal, which consists today of eating greens dipped in salt water or vinegar, and safun, where the head of the household breaks the middle matzah into two pieces and places one piece, what we today call the afikomen, aside. The picture on the bottom of the page depicts both acts, karpas on the left, and on the right, as you can see, a little bird-headed boy placing the afikomen beneath the tablecloths. In fact, this depiction may be some of our earliest evidence for the child's game that this part of the ritual has either evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective, into. Indeed, one of the purposes of placing this picture on this page may have been precisely to tell the children to hide the afikomen at this point in the Seder. As you can see from this image, the illustrations in this Haggadah and others like it are folksy, almost cartoonish, much less sophisticated and stylized than those in the Sephardic Haggadot. Despite their geographical distance from each other, the two Jewish centers in Ashkenaz and Sfarad were very much in contact, and especially from the 14th century on, images and motifs from Sephardic Haggadot, like the pictures for the four sons, made their way into Ashkenazic Haggadot. Book production in both Ashkenaz and Sfarad, however, generally declined from the beginning of the 14th century, as Jewish life in both areas was severely curtailed by persecutions and forced expulsions. Over this century and the next, many Jews fled both centers, some to North Africa and Ottoman Turkey, others to Eastern Europe, and many to Italy, which became a haven especially for Ashkenazic refugees. And among these refugees were a good number of scribes. Now, Italy was the home of the longest continuously inhabited Jewish community in Europe, going back to Imperial Rome, if not earlier, and had long played a formative role in Jewish book culture. The site of the earliest dated Hebrew manuscript written in Europe, Italy was also, beginning in the 15th century, the major site of Jewish book production. Nearly 1/3 of all dated medieval Hebrew manuscripts were written in Italy between 1350 and 1550. Now, in general, the Haggadot produced in Italy follow the Ashkenazic model in terms of their overall structure as essentially domestic books. Germany and North Italy were closely associated during this period, and scribes and illustrators like Joel ben Simeon regularly moved over the Alps and between the two countries. The illustrated Haggadot produced in the two areas, however, defy easy categorization. Some, like the second Nuremberg Haggadah pictured here, have margins packed with drawings of both biblical and ritual scenes, and the illustrations are somewhat reminiscent of the popular folkish style characteristic of the Bird's Haggadah. On the other hand, there are the Haggadot produced by Joel ben Simeon and his associates like Meir ben Israel Jaffe of Ulm, the scribe of the first Cincinnati Haggadah, which tend to resemble the 14th century Sephardic Haggadot in their elegance and luxuriousness, and which clearly display the absorption of Italianate features and their use of color and delicate penwork. For all their differences, however, these 15th and early 16th century German and Italian Haggadot share a vision that contrasts sharply to that found in the Spanish Haggadot of the previous century. The Passover Haggadah is a Jewish book of redemption par excellence. This is its major theme, and it looks forward to the redemption in the future by recalling and commemorating the redemption in the past. The most distinctive feature of the Haggadah as a text and as a book is that one can trace its development almost step by step as its Jewish authors and producers move deeper and deeper into their various diasporas and places of geographical and historical exile, from Roman Palestine to Parthian Babylonia, from Babylonia to the European centers of Ashkenaz and Sfarad, and from those centers to all the later homes of Jews in North Africa, Arabia, Eastern Europe, and finally to the Americas and the State of Israel. As one follows these journeys, one sees how closely linked in the Jewish experience are exile and redemption. The imagining of one is inevitably shaped by the experience of the other. It is this linkage between imagining the redemption and experiencing exile that most profoundly informs the Haggadah's history. The German and Italian Haggadot of the 15th and 16th centuries capture one specific moment in that history, which is also the story of the Jewish imagination. That moment and its conception of redemption, the common vision these Haggadot share, is captured in one specific page found in many of these Haggadot. Following the Crusader massacres of the 11th and 12th century, Ashkenazic Jews inserted a special passage known as Shvo Chamatcha that invokes God's wrath upon the Gentile nations. In its earliest version in Ashkenaz, the passage consisted solely of Psalm 79:6. Pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you, upon the kingdoms that do not invoke your name. But the passage was quickly adopted in many cases, adapted in virtually every rite, including those of Sfarad, in many cases with the addition of more verses cursing the Gentiles. Beginning in the second quarter of the 15th century, on the page containing the Shvo Chamatcha, first German and later Italian Haggadot regularly began to include a picture of the Messiah riding on a donkey, often accompanied by Elijah blowing a shofar, and arriving at the home of a Jew. The meaning of the picture's placement on this page is slightly ambiguous. Wasn't meant to suggest that vengeance against the Gentiles would come as part of the messianic scenario, or that the Jews could only imagine such vengeance taking place after the Messiah had arrived? For us, what is most noteworthy about the illustration is that the Messiah is frequently pictured, as I said, as arriving at the private home of an individual Jewish family. This moment in the Seder, in which the Shvo Chamatcha is recited, also happened to coincide with the ritual act of opening the front door to the home, an act that may have long preceded the insertion of the Shvo Chamatcha into the Haggadah, but that was interpreted by Ashkenazic Jews as an invitation to the prophet Elijah, who might actually turn up just then to herald the impending arrival of the Messiah. In fact, one early 16th century writer, the apostate Jew Antonius Margarita, records a custom among Ashkenazic Jews to have someone dressed up as Elijah fall through the open door into the room at precisely this moment. Now, no two depictions of the scene are identical. Individual artists each developed the image in their own way, and in her essay on the Washington Haggadah's illustrations, Katrin Kogman-Appel describes in detail the singular features of Joel's version in the Washington Haggadah. In all cases, however, the arrival of the Messiah is imagined in dramatically familiar and intimate terms, virtually as a kind of personal salvation, not unlike the notions of personal salvation that were also beginning to penetrate pre-Reformation Christianity at roughly the same time. This, then, is a perfect example of how the specific context of the diasporic culture in which the Haggadah was produced profoundly shaped its idea of redemption. From what we know, illustrated Haggadot like the Washington Haggadah were typically commissioned or bought by the increasingly wealthy members of the growing population of Jewish bankers, merchants, and doctors in Italy and southern Germany. This was a quickly developing market, and it helped support and produce scribes and illustrators like Joel ben Simeon. On all counts, Joel was both a representative figure of his age and also an exceptional figure in several respects. In the first place, he was both a scribe and an artist, two positions that were often held by different persons. He copied and illustrated his own manuscripts, he illustrated other scribes' manuscripts, and he collaborated with other scribes and illustrators to jointly produce lavish manuscripts. All in all, there are 10 manuscripts that Joel himself signed, and between 4 and 9 others that scholars have either attributed or associated with him. This high number of manuscripts is decidedly unusual, if not entirely unparalleled. Joel was born in Cologne in the early 1420s. His full name was Joel Feibusch ben Simeon, and in some manuscripts written outside Germany, he recalled his birthplace by calling himself Ha-Ashkenazi, the Ashkenazi, or the German. In 1424, when Joel was a very young child, the Jews were expelled from Cologne, and his family moved to nearby Bonn, where Joel was raised and lived until 1445 or 1450. He also appears to have received his early training as a scribe and artist in Bonn, and it's possible that he began to travel as an itinerant scribe illustrator even before he left Bonn for good. After finally leaving Bonn, in any case, sometime before 1452, 1453, Joel went south across the Alps to northern Italy. Over the next 30 to 40 years, the surviving manuscripts that he wrote, those which are either signed or attributed to him, include at least 7 more Haggadot, 3 prayer books, and 1 commentary to the Book of Psalms. These manuscripts certainly represent only a fraction of his output. We have no idea how many manuscripts he actually produced. Although we know no more details about his life, it's clear that during this 40-year period, he returned to Germany at least twice to write or illustrate books. During the second trip in 1478, he wrote the Washington Haggadah. Joel then returned to Italy, and scholars believe that as late as 1492, when he would have been 70 or close to it, he was still working intensely, writing a beautifully decorated prayer book known as a Moskowitz Siddur, and participating with a team of artists who jointly illustrated the spectacular Rothschild Machzor. Joel's movements back and forth between Germany and Italy had a major impact on his artistic style. He always remained essentially an Ashkenazic scribe, and to a large extent a German illustrator, but he absorbed the Italian feeling for depth and detail. As Professor Kogman-Appel notes, he was an active agent of cultural exchange, both in his art, but also in liturgical and ritual matters. His Haggadot, and as we shall see, the Washington Haggadah in particular, epitomize the transitional nature of the period in which he lived, a period in which different cultures came increasingly into contact, just as the age of manuscripts was also turning into the age of print. Joel was both a master scribe and a master illustrator. In her talk after mine, Professor Kogman-Appel will speak about Joel's drawings and paintings. I'll concentrate my remarks upon his mastery of the arts of scribal technique, and specifically the kinds of decoration associated with scribal virtuosity. This page is the very first page of the Haggadah and contains the instructions for the search for leaven on the night preceding Passover, the blessings recited over the search, and on the bottom of the page, the order of the Seder, Kadesh, Urachatz, and so on. To differentiate these different sections on the page for the reader, Joel, like other scribes, wrote the various sections in distinct hands and sizes, in all 4 different sizes and scripts. Thus, the core text of the Haggadah he wrote in a medium-sized square script, and for other sections he used 3 other sizes, a very large size for illuminated words at the beginning of major sections, a somewhat smaller but still large size for initial words of important passages, and a smaller size which he used for instructions and for some blessings. In addition, he also used a semi-cursive calligraphic script in different sizes. On this page, you can see the large size which he used for initial words and passages. Now, as I just said, one purpose of these different types and sizes of script was to create for the reader a visually transparent hierarchy of texts, but the variation also served a clearly aesthetic purpose in making the less uniform page more interesting to look at. Most of the text is written in a black, dark brown ink, but as you can see, Joel also regularly used red and blue inks, as well as green and lighter brown ones, also to vary the text color. Especially noteworthy are the large painted initial panels, which usually have a blue background with white filigree sprigs and round white flowers with red centers, while the initial words themselves and the frames are in burnished gold leaf. The one you see here, the beginning of the Halachma section, is one of the most beautiful in the Haggadah, with its very large square letters in gold leaf against a blue background of red and white flowers, a small gem that literally turns a word into an ornament. In all these examples, you see how Joel's scribal virtuosity extended beyond the mere writing of the text to the overall aesthetics of the text page. One of the general concerns, indeed a virtual obsession of medieval Jewish scribes, was line justification, which in the case of Hebrew texts, which are written right to left, means justified left margins. In order to maintain the justification, scribes utilized different techniques, and Joel employed nearly all of them. Now, on this single page, you can see several of these techniques. On line 1, in green, the word kema is abbreviated and truncated. On line 6 from the top, in yellow at the end of the line, Pur lachatzenu is squeezed and compressed. The technical term for this is dilated. And on line 9, in orange, the final mem in the last word on the line is elongated. The most individualistic technique that Jewish scribes used for justification, however, was the employment of graphic forms which look like Hebrew letters, but are actually nonsense letters. Many scribes had their own individual graphic fillers, and on this single page, with its beautiful initial word panel, Joel used the filler 4 times on lines 1, 2, 4, and 7. While the shape of this graphic filler conforms to a basic type used by other Ashkenazic scribes, Joel made it his own by adding to it the descending stroke which curls to the left at its bottom, and at other times analogous ascending strokes. In this way, the graphic filler became, in effect, Joel's scribal trademark, as the Israeli codicologist Malachi Bet Aryeh has called it. Indeed, this unique filler is so characteristic and and unique to Joel's work that scholars have been able to use it to attribute and identify unsigned manuscripts as having been written by Joel. Of all Joel's distinguishing features as a scribe artist, however, the most distinctive are his delicate filigreed panels drawn in various colored inks, which surround the initial words of some key passages. In the Washington Haggadah, some of these frames consist of intricate floral patterns, swirling sprigs and dense curly leaves, as the art historian Bezalel Narkis described them, which show a clear Italianate influence. But other touches are more humorous and witty. On the right side of a number of panels, Joel drew a Joel drew a grotesque face in profile, grimacing toward the outer margin, with a curlicue-like tongue and a long twisting strand of a beard. The first one of these grotesques to appear in the Haggadah is on this page, attached to the initial word in red, Baruch, that begins the Kiddush, the blessing over wine with which the Seder begins. On the facing page in the book, at the top right, the initial word Vayechulu, and we're completed, is framed by a king emerging out of a worm-like long neck. And on this page is also found my own personal favorite. Directly beneath the drawing of Jacob, directly beneath the drawing of Jacob, our traveling forefather, at the beginning of the next paragraph, the grotesque profile once again leans out from the side of the Hebrew word vayered, while on top of the word, as you can see, a lively hare flees in the opposite direction, maybe because he knows that Jacob is about to descend to Egypt and he wants to get out of there as quickly as he can. Elsewhere, in fact, hares in Jewish books often symbolize the people of Israel, and that may be the case here too. And finally, near the Haggadah's conclusion, at the beginning of the Great Hallel, the grotesque profile appears for the last time in an especially ornate and beautiful panel. To my eye, at least, the grotesque here also looks a little tired. I think he's ready to tuck it in and go to sleep, like some of the participants at the Seder as well. For the children at the Seder, in any case, and perhaps for some of the adults, these grotesques were a kind of 15th century version of Where's Waldo? They play a game of hide and seek with the reader. At first, you do not notice them, but when you do, they take you by surprise, making you look ever harder at a text you thought was utterly familiar. Now, taken separately, all these individual scribal practices may seem to be mere details of technique, but collectively, they point to the ways in which a professional scribe like Joel defined his individuality, his character, within a profession that was otherwise powerfully governed by convention. Indeed, such means of individuation turned a figure like Joel from being a mere copyist into a scribe. Even so, scribes always remained copyists in a strict sense. That is to say, their main job was to transcribe their texts from other manuscripts as accurately as possible. Accuracy and faithfulness to the original were the main standards by which copyists were judged. Nonetheless, scribes constantly faced choices as to what to copy, and this task was complicated by the fact that most manuscripts included marginal glosses, corrections, and other additions. Sometimes a scribe copied from multiple manuscripts, and these too may have differed in details, or even in matters of practice when they derived from communities with different customs. In these cases, it was a scribe, not a rabbi or another authority, who decided what to write and copy. And in this way, scribes like Joel served as authorities and as agents of cultural exchange between different communities. In both roles, they could exert great influence and impact. And at other times, by copying certain passages or practices, which they could also preserve long-held customs that were on the brink of falling out of usage. Let me give examples of both phenomena. Because our Haggadah was written while Joel was in Germany, it is not surprising that by and large it follows the contemporary Ashkenazic rite, including a few early features that have since ceased to be practiced. Thus, Before eating the karpas, that hors d'oeuvre section I mentioned earlier, the greens that represent the appetizer course, it is customary to wash one's hands in remembrance of the laws of cultic purity that obtained during the temple period. Because this ritual washing is largely symbolic, however, there was a long-time dispute as to whether or not it is necessary to recite a blessing before doing the ritual washing. Eventually, by the 16th century at the latest, it was conclusively decided that a blessing was not required, and that is the custom followed today by observant Jews. In medieval Ashkenaz, however, opinions were still divided, and in the Washington Haggadah, in the instruction outlined in yellow in the middle of the page, Joel states that the blessing is required. In the same instructions, here in the section outlined by a green line, Joel also writes that one dips the karpas in charoset, the dipping sauce made from fruits and nuts. And indeed, this was the original custom in Ashkenaz. At a later period, salt water or vinegar was substituted for the charoset in order to differentiate the karpas from the bitter herbs, the maror, which are eaten later in the Seder and which are still dipped in charoset today, while the karpas is dipped in salt water. But Joel still dipped his karpas in charoset. Now, in both these cases, Joel preserved ancient Ashkenazic practice. In another place, he records a striking innovation that he very likely brought back to Germany from Italy. Since the Talmudic period, the moror, the bitter herb, was typically eaten in the form of a bitter lettuce called latuga, from the Old French laituga, which in turn derives from the Latin lactuta. And even today, many Jews use romaine or other bitter types of lettuce for moror at the Seder. On this page, however, in the lengthy section in the middle of the page, in semi-cursive script, Joel writes that when one eats the ancient sage Hillel's so-called matzah sandwich with moror as its filling, one uses horseradish, which he calls by the German name of meritish. This instruction is among our earliest pieces of evidence for one of the most monumental shifts in the entire history of the Jewish people, the transition from lettuce to horseradish as the preferred form of bitter herb moror. In this otherwise unassuming passage, Joel, in other words, is describing a historical moment of decisive, dramatic change in Jewish history. And at still other times, Joel refused to choose between German and Italian practice and preserved both. At the beginning of the Haggadah, on its first folio, inside a delicately pen-drawn, unraveled scroll at the very top of the page, Joel wrote two formulaic scribal formulae, Betuv Gada Atchil Lichtov Seder Shel Pesach, with good luck I shall write the order of the Passover Seder, and Kvodcha Hashem, for your honor, God. The first formula is known to have been used by scribes in Ashkenaz and Provenance, and occasionally by Ashkenazic scribes in Italy, but the second formula was exclusively used by Italian scribes, and as was suggested by Moritz Steinsnyder, may have been borrowed from Latin scribal eulogies like Deo Laus et Honor. The presence of both formulae in the Washington Haggadah epitomizes Joel's own position between the two different scribal cultures. Now, of course, Joel was also human and made mistakes while copying. This happens even to the most skillful scribes. On this page, Joel forgot the word Yahalalu, they will praise, in the middle of the line, noticed his mistake, and wrote it in the margin himself. On this page, he skipped Psalms 118:8 and apparently never noticed it, and then a later Ashkenazic owner did and added it to the margins in a rather ugly hand. And on still other pages, later users of the Haggadah wrote still other corrections and additions in the margins. This is the Shvo Chamatcha page, again, which we talked about earlier, containing curses against the Gentile enemies of Israel. The original Ashkenazic practice was to recite a single verse, Psalm 79:6, which is all that Joel himself wrote in the Haggadah. But as you can see on the top of the page, a later user of the Haggadah added another 9 verses, and still another person a 10th verse. These additional verses accord with the northern French rite, but they're written in an 18th century Italian hand, presumably by a later owner of the Haggadah. Now, as this last remark suggests, the corrections and marginal additions to the Haggadah by later hands are important not only for what they can tell us about Joel's scribal competence or about local customs and rites, but also for reconstructing the history of the Haggadah and its own life after it came into existence. The Washington Haggadah's early history remains shrouded in some mystery. Like most professional Jewish scribes in the late Middle Ages, Joel typically wrote on commission for specific clients. The colophon of this Haggadah, however, does not mention a patron or commissioner for the book, which one usually finds in colophons, and this uncharacteristic omission has led some scholars to suggest that Joel may have initially written the Haggadah to be held as stock and then sold later whenever a buyer would turn up. This untraditional practice had in fact become more common in the last decades of the manuscript age and anticipates the modes of production after print. The same rationale would also explain the empty final pages of the Last Gathering, which Joel may have deliberately left empty in the event that a customer wished to have an additional text written there. And in fact, this turned out to be the case. The customer who finally bought the Haggadah requested that Joel add two special texts, the Eruvei Chatzerot and Eruvei Tafshilin, both of which are special prayers for ritual ceremonies performed in the event that the 2 days of Passover fall on Thursday and Friday. The rituals allow a person to prepare for the Sabbath on Friday afternoon, even though it's a holiday. Now, these two ceremonies need to be performed before Passover begins, and they should therefore be written at the beginning of the Haggadah, not at its end. And in most Ashkenazic Haggadot, this is, in fact, where the prayers are transcribed. The fact that they're found in the Haggadah's final folios adds to the likelihood that they were added after Joel had written the Haggadah and at a specific customer's request. In fact, 1478 was a year when Passover began on Wednesday night and continued through Thursday and Friday, thus necessitating the performance of the two ceremonies that year. If Joel completed his Haggadah on January 29, 1478, he probably began it in late 1477 and was not yet aware of the exact weekdays on which Passover would fall in the coming year. By the time he completed and sold the Haggadah, however, his customer did know that he would need the texts, and therefore requested Joel to write them at the book's conclusion. We do not know who this first customer was who bought or owned the Haggadah, but from Hebrew words that are faintly written on this page in an Ashkenazic hand, probably written as practice phrases, and which appear to have been written not long after Joel wrote the manuscript, it seems quite certain that the first owner was a German Jew. And from the ugly marginal edition of Psalms 118:8 that we saw earlier, which is written in the 17th century Ashkenazic hand, it seems likely that the Haggadah was still in Germany a good 100 years later. Furthermore, the absence of any signatures of Christian censors from the 16th or 17th century, which would almost certainly be found in the book if it had been in Italy during this period, strongly suggests that the Haggadah remained in Germany until the 18th century. By the 19th century, however, we know for certain that the Haggadah was owned by the Provençali family in Mantua, a very distinguished family with a lineage that went back to Moses ben David Provençal, one of the most distinguished Talmudists of the Renaissance period, and his brother David ben Abraham Provençal, who attempted to establish a Jewish university in Mantua. On this blank page, at the end of the Haggadah, are found again faint lines that name 4 of the members of the Provençali family in the late 19th century: Amelia, Sapphira, Umberto, and Attilio. And on this page, again at the back of the Haggadah, there is a remarkable note written by one Ettore Finzi in German, dated April 7th, 1879, which was the eve of Passover that year, where he writes that they are sitting at the Seder table where they have just sung the first part of the Gada, that's what he calls the Haggadah, the Gada, and are awaiting the food. And after it arrives, they start eating, and a Tory signs off, a guten Appetit. Stains, like the large oval on the bottom of this page, probably stem from wine drops and confirm the fact that the Haggadah was actually used at Seders. It was not, in other words, a trophy book that its owners kept locked up in a case for display. For all its beauty and monetary value, it was actually used for the purpose for which Joel ben Simeon had originally written it, as a Haggadah for a Seder. All this changed in the early 20th century. While we do not know the exact facts for certain, on June 10, 1902, a book dealer who happened to be in Mantua at the time wrote to Judge Meyer Sulzberger of Philadelphia. Sulzberger was one of the great Jewish communal leaders and collectors of Jewish books of the period, that he was sending him 8 rare books and manuscripts he had bought in Italy, including an illustrated Haggadah written in 1478. This was undoubtedly the Washington Haggadah. For the latter, the book dealer wrote, the asking price was $500. But in a later letter, the dealer conceded that his original asking price may have been too high, and he hinted that he was willing to bargain. Apparently, though, Sulzberger was still not interested, and the Haggadah remained in the dealer's stock for another 14 years. The book dealer was a Russian-born Jew named Ephraim Dinard, who was one of the most exceptional figures in the history of the Jewish book in the last 2 centuries. A bookseller and bibliographer, a publisher and the author-editor of some 50 books of his own, a Zionist activist and publicist, a major crank, and a vitriolic polemicist who railed against a myriad of persons and causes not to his personal liking, Hasidism and Hasidim, Kabbalah, Reform Judaism, he didn't differentiate, communism, the great rabbinic scholar, later chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Solomon Schechter. As you can see, he had a lot of personal dislikes. Dinard was a seminal and still insufficiently recognized figure in laying the foundations for Jewish scholarship in America. Born in the Baltic region of the Tsarist Empire in 1846, Dinard grew up in Lithuania, moved to White Russia, and then went to Crimea, where he became the amanuensis and factotum of the infamous Abraham Furkovich, the Karaite book dealer and collector who was probably the greatest dealer of Hebraica of all time, in addition to being a major forger, thief, finagler, and all-around scoundrel. As you can tell from this picture, he was also a spiffy dresser who liked to play the role of Karaite elder to the hilt. Furkovich also appears to have been a very good teacher and to have taught Dinard quite a bit about the trade as he practiced it. Here's Dinard again. Over time, Dinard grew into an extremely shrewd book dealer who was also deeply mistrusted even by some of his most loyal customers. His indefatigability in obtaining manuscripts and rare printings became legendary early on, as did the questionability of his methods in acquiring them. As Alexander Marx, probably the greatest expert on Jewish books during his lifetime, wrote about Dinard, how he managed to attain some of these unique volumes I do not know, but undoubtedly a considerable number would have perished in the disorders of the last decades if Dinard had not found them a safe resting place in great Jewish and general libraries. In October 1888, with his wife, 4 young daughters, a niece, and 11 pieces of luggage, all of them apparently stuffed with manuscripts and books, Dinard arrived in the United States, where he lived for the next 40 years, with the exception of a brief aborted attempt to settle in Palestine. During these years, Dinard lived in Newark, St. Louis, and for the last 12 years of his life, New Orleans. And in all these places, he published newspapers, including one of the first Hebrew newspapers in America, journals, and many books. Following a time-honored tradition in Hebrew publishing of using fictional places of imprint and invented dates, Dinard issued books from places he called Baltunauka, Chattertown in Yiddish, and the biblical city of Sodom. Both books were actually printed in Newark, New Jersey. And he dated the latter book as having been printed in the printing press of Raziel the Angel 50 years before the creation of the world. That's a very old book. Dinard's lasting contribution, however, was as an agent in laying the foundations of America's greatest public and institutional collections of Hebraica and Judaica. Early on, possibly even before he emigrated to America, Dinard recognized that America was likely to become a center for modern critical Jewish scholarship, and that there would be a need for great Jewish research libraries in the New World to support that research. His main goal, he wrote, and here I'm quoting, was to establish libraries in all the leading cities of our land. It is my hope that in the course of time I shall succeed in decimating Jewish literature in this barren country. If a Jewish scholar needs an ancient text now, he must go to Europe, to the British Museum, or the Bodleian in Oxford. So to remedy that situation, Dinard began by persuading professors like Richard Gottheil of Columbia University to establish Hebraica collections in their university libraries, and private collectors like Judge Sulzberger to build collections which they would eventually donate to public institutions. He also sold an important collection of Judaica objects to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., whose librarian at the time was Cyrus Adler, later to become the president of Dropsy College in Philadelphia, the first non-sectarian institution of higher learning in ancient Near Eastern and Jewish studies in America, and today the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His final sale was that of his own private collection, 12,000 printed volumes, including 16 incunables and 29 manuscripts, to Harvard University, just months before his death in 1930, thereby establishing the foundation for Widener Library's magnificent collection. Dinard's greatest dream, however, was to establish a major Judaica collection in America's national library, the Library of Congress, that would rival the great national libraries of Europe, like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Library in London, and the National Library in Berlin. Now, it was a happy coincidence that precisely at this time, the Library of Congress itself was in the process of becoming a major research library that sought to cover all of world literature and culture. The Library of Congress had been founded originally as a library for Congress in order to serve the particular needs of its members. In 1899, however, Herbert Putnam, a man who could not have been more different from Dinard, was appointed librarian. Putnam's father was the founder of the Putnam Publishing House. Putnam himself was educated at Harvard and Columbia Law, and previously had served as head of the public libraries in Minneapolis and Boston. A true American blue blood, Putnam was also a man of broad cultural and creative vision who envisioned the library as a model of scholarly research in America and as encompassing all of the world's cultures. To this end, in 1904, Putnam acquired a huge collection of classical Indian literature, and shortly later, equally impressive collections of Russian, Chinese, and Japanese literature. Now, Dinard witnessed all this, and he presently sensed that the time was now right to realize his own vision of establishing a major Hebraica collection in the Library of Congress. This was actually something he had unsuccessfully attempted some 15 years earlier. In 1909, though, he turned to Putnam again with an offer to sell him a collection, and here I'm quoting, of the oldest and rarest books which are to be found only in the British Museum, and some of them are not to be found even there. Putnam's response was slow in coming, but in 1912, with Silas Adler's assistance, he approached Jacob Schiff, the German-born New York financier and Jewish philanthropist, Jacob Schiff, to ask if he would be willing to purchase Dinard's collection as, quote, a gift to the nation. This gift would serve as, and again I'm quoting, a recognition of the part which Hebrew history, literature, and tradition, as well as the Hebrew race, play and will play in the affairs of this country. Schiff finally agreed, and the Library of Congress purchased Dinard's collection, which consisted of 10,000 books and pamphlets. This purchase came to be known as the first Dinard collection. In 1914, Schiff again bankrolled the purchase of a second collection of 4,200 volumes from Dinard, which he presented to the Library of Congress as the second Dinard collection. In 1916, the library purchased with its own funds a third collection of 2,300 items, and in 1919, a fourth collection of some 3,000 volumes. Altogether, Dinard sold the Library of Congress some 19,300 volumes and laid a strong foundation for its future growth into one of the world's great Hebraica and Judaica collections. The Washington Haggadah most likely arrived at the Library of Congress as part of the third Dinard collection in 1919. And there it remains today, one of the library's treasures and a highlight of its by now truly extensive, even exhaustive, Judaic and Hebraic collection. Dinard's dream has indeed been realized. The Washington Haggadah, however, is no longer a functioning Haggadah, no longer a ritual text used at a Seder. It is a Hebrew illustrated manuscript of invaluable worth, available to scholars for research, a window into the world in which it was created and its Jewish culture. But now, through this reissued facsimile edition, the Washington Haggadah is again an accessible book that can be read, studied, looked at, and even brought to the Seder table. It's not even too expensive that one can't afford to spill some drops of wine on its pages. And finally, the Washington Haggadah is genuine proof that the Jews and the Jewish book have truly arrived in America. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Katrin Kogman-Appel. Professor Kogman-Appel holds the Evelyn Metz Memorial Research Chair at the Department of the Arts, Ben-Gurion University of the Negev Sheva. She is currently here in the States, though, visiting the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She received her PhD in 1994 from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's published widely on the relationship between Jewish and Christian art in late antiquity and on Hebrew manuscript painting. You will see her works in journals such as Geste, the Zeitschrift für Kunstgeschichte, the Art Bulletin, Speculum, and others. She is the author of a German book on 15th century Haggadot from Germany, published in 1999, of Jewish book art between Islam and Christianity, which appeared in 2004, and of Illuminated Haggadot from Medieval Spain, which was published in 2007 and won the Premio del Rey Prize of the American Historical Association in 2009. She's currently working on a book about the cultural and social background of the Leipzig Mazor. And her talk today is Joel Ben Simeon, illustrating the Washington Haggadah. Professor Kogman-Appel.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this lovely introduction and for putting up the Washington Haggadah, which I have not seen yet today, but I certainly will after we are finished here. So let's start. Here we go. In my heart counsels how to reply to him who asks and says, "Who painted these pages?" I shall answer him, "I'm he, Feibush, called Joel, for Jacob Mattathiah, may he live long, a pious man." This colophon, found in the so-called London Haggadah, copied by Meir Yaffe, a scribe from Ulm in circa 1460, for a patron, Jacob Mattathiah, from the same town. Unlike most medieval colophons, it defines Joel ben Simeon not as a scribe, but an illustrator. Medieval artists or illustrators hardly ever did sign their works. And here we have this man with a clearly defined professional identity. In fact, Joel ben Simeon must have been an all-rounder of late medieval and early modern book trade. As we have learned already, he must have been born around 1420 in Cologne and may have received training as a scribe in the Rhineland. He reached Italy around the middle of the century, and there he seems to have received some artistic training as well. as from now on his style became quite Italianate. In fact, for all his career, he would use a drawing style that was quite common in Italian book illustration throughout the 15th century. While still in the Rhineland, he produced two manuscripts still extant. One is the so-called first Nuremberg Haggadah, his scribal style being quite professional. His drawings are a bit crude at that stage. They are, however, clearly embedded in a typical German tradition of illustration. The so-called spared ground technique, for example, the white or the parchment-colored figures against the ink background are very typical for German illustration, and we find them all over, especially southern Germany, throughout the 15th century. Also, these manuscripts, of which the first Nuremberg Haggadah is one of them, have abundant marginal illustrations, which were originally found in that manuscript, but unfortunately have been very badly trimmed, and thus our knowledge of this part of the graphic work is quite limited. The practice of unframed marginal illustration, however, was very common in Christian German book illustration of the time. In 1452 at the latest, Joel can be traced in Italy signing a mahzor in Cremona. By then he was a young professional who, as many of his Ashkenazi co-religionists, had decided to try his luck further to the south, to cross the Alps and to settle in Italy. For a young Jew who had grown up in the German lands, facing the threat of persecution and expulsion, northern Italy seemed like the perfect alternative. In contrast to Central Europe, where Jews were often expelled or suffered constant harassment, violent persecution, and forced baptism, early modern Italian culture facilitated acculturation and cultural exchange. Only a few of Joel's Italian colophons mention places, and it is quite clear that he did not settle anywhere for long, but rather continued to move, seeking work in various locations. Around the same time, he may have been involved also, in some way or the other, in the making of at least 4 Passover Haggadot. And it is in these books that he would establish and develop a rich repertoire of Haggadah illustration that would prove to be the foundation of this genre for the generations to come. As Professor Stern has mentioned already, he would return at least twice to Germany, around 1460, when he participated in the production of the mentioned London Haggadah, and in 1478, when he wrote and illustrated the Washington Haggadah. The Washington Haggadah thus reflects Joel's work at the peak of his career. By the time he signed it, he was a mature scribe and artist who had traveled between the cultures. In his migrations between the two regions, Joel was, in a sense, an agent of cultural exchange, importing elements of Ashkenazi Haggadah illustration into Italy and taking back stylistic devices acquired in the region south of the Alps. Let us take a closer look at the imagery of the Washington Haggadah as a representative of Joel's repertoire. The text on each page leaves ample margins for the drawings. Originally, these margins were still broader. They were trimmed during the later rebinding. However, that trimming hardly affected the illustrations. They are more or less complete. In the corners, we can sometimes see that the color faded, as the book must have been extensively used. Let us take a very short look at these images, and I won't follow them here page by page. I'd rather prefer to look at them arranged in thematic groups. The series of marginal illustrations begin with 2 images that depict the search for leaven and the burning of the final leftovers of leaven found in the house. On the left, a man is scrutinizing a cupboard, while on the right, a youth is using a pair of bellows to steer a fire. Several other images follow a similar approach. A man pouring wine illustrates the text. In what way is this night different from all other nights? 2 women and a man are busying themselves with the preparation of the meal as an illustration to the Dayenu prayer, as a reminder that the time has now come to get the meal ready. A somewhat grotesque monkey seated on a red cushion holds the matzah. And on the following page, an apparently unhappy couple represents the maror, the bitter herbs, by extension, the bitter life of Egypt, in Egypt. A luxuriously dressed man raises a cup and illustrates the text, "Therefore, we are obligated to thank, acclaim, and praise." As in all other Haggadot associated with Joel ben Simeon, the questions of the four men are illustrated by four figures, each representing a certain social type. The wise son, up here, is shown as a seated scholar with an open book. The wicked son as a knight, a Gentile, as a matter of fact. The simple son is shown as a man, as a humble man, in a somewhat worn-out cloak, seated on the floor. And the fourth man, the one who does not know how to ask, appears as a jester. I shall come back to these figures towards the end of my talk. This elaborate composition, illustrating pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you, we have already met before. And I would just like to add a further note on it. Joel left a particular large margin at the base of this page to allow sufficient space for an image. It shows the castle-like structure on the left with a youth peeking through the door and inviting Elijah, or the Messiah, who, riding on a donkey, approaches from the right. He is accompanied by an entire family seated behind him on the donkey's rear. The figure on the donkey is accompanied by followers, and one even, just at the very end, I don't know if you can see it, catching or grasping to the tail. The mentioned 16th century text by Margarita, who was a baptized Jew, reports a Jewish folk belief about the coming of the Messiah. Now, Margarita had taken, as a baptized apostate, he had taken an anti-Jewish position, so we have his source as the only written source for this folkloric kind of motive, and we don't have the original Jewish version. So we have to look through his eyes to understand what he's meaning to tell us. And I'm quoting Margarita. "According to the lies of the Jews, when the Messiah comes, he will ride upon an ass and seat all the Jews upon the ass, while all the Christians will sit on the ass's tail. Then the Messiah will ride with all his passengers into the sea, and when he comes to the depth of the sea, the donkey will drop its tail, and all the Christians will fall into the sea and drown. And indeed, this will have to be a very big ass. But even a bigger ass is a person who believes such things," unquote. So we have to filter out the anti-Jewish remarks here in order to get to the original motive, which is quite folkloristic and no text of it exists. One scholar suggested that the last person in the Washington Haggadah on the right, trying to hold on to the tail, is a Christian maidservant. Now, the last image of this series shows, here's the person that might be a Christian maidservant. The last image of this series shows Daniel in the lion's den as an illustration to the poem, "Then you performed many miracles at night," or rather specifically the sentence in the poem, "The one who was saved from the lion's den souls the frights of night." Since its early days in the German lands, Joel ben Simeon took a fancy in verbal puns, expressions from the text translated literally into visual language. A typical example appears here near the text, "Go forth and learn what Laban, the Aramean, thought to do to our ancestor Jacob." The marginal illustration shows a man in medieval traveling gear and some luggage. Emphasizing the act of going forth, he moves forward energetically on a small piece of green land. The text, or part of the text of the Hallel, reads, in distress I call on God. The word distress, matzor, can also be understood as siege, and the verse would read, from the siege I call on God. Joel drew a walled town with a large tower, in whose window the face of an imprisoned man, apparently David, the author of the psalm, can be discerned. So here we find this little portrait here. Another theme that Joel depicted occasionally, and which, however, for some reason is not included in the Washington Haggadah, is an elaborate composition of the thematic high point of the Haggadah, the crossing of the Red Sea. This example is taken from the London Haggadah, and it spreads the scene over a double page. On the right-hand page, a massed Egyptian army approaches, and on the left, Moses follows the column of fire, leading the Israelites safely through the waters. What is interesting in this composition is not only its rich iconography, but also, and most importantly, the spatial representation of the two crowds of people reaching relatively deep into the picture space. Here we have really a mass, a crowd of an army, and we see the parts of it really very small and perspectively drawn. Early Ashkenazic work had known nothing of the kind. Old Testament illustration has a long tradition in Italy, reaching back to the early Christian period when the churches of Rome were decorated with elaborate narrative cycles of the history of the Israelites. The crossing of the Red Sea figures prominently in this tradition. Let us take just a short look at Cosimo Rosselli's composition of the Red Sea scenario in the Sistine Chapel from circa 1480. It postdates Joel's work, but it gives us a sense of how a 15th century Italian artist would have approached the subject. Although in the details of his figure style, Joel never fully acquired early modern Italian perspective and three-dimensional articulation, the organization of the picture space here is certainly indebted to Italian art to a quite high degree. The particular example of the London Haggadah was done for a patron in Southern Germany. And it seems that in the years to come, Joel's model was quite influential and find attempts at similar compositions also in Haggadah, produced locally in Franconia, for example. And this is a Southern German, apparently from Franconia, Haggadah now in the Israel Museum, that really attempts to create a similar composition. However, here the graphic idiom is much flatter and less perspectively drawn. Joel Ben-Simeon was a skilled maker of books. Most of the books he left are Haggadot, and it seems indeed that he specialized in that genre. In the Haggadot associated with him, we encounter a rich and rather original repertoire, which would become quite common in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. But apart from developing that repertoire, Joel introduced a further element into his illustrations. They are not merely a visual guideline to follow the Haggadah text. They are, as a matter of fact, a lively mirror of society, as Joel indeed had a very keen and curious eye, who looked very sharply at his surroundings. His observation of people cuts through several social strata, and in what follows we shall take a closer look of how he viewed some of the representatives of the communities he encountered. Commissioning an illuminated manuscript in the Middle Ages was a costly affair. We can easily imagine that the owners of the Haggadot, and here we have an example from the London Haggadah and one from the Washington Haggadah. So we can easily imagine that the owners of the Haggadot are meant to be represented in some of the drawings and paintings on the margins of Joel's Haggadot. I should add here that this may have or was apparently overpainted by a later German painter by the name of Johannes Bähmler, but the iconography would still be very representative of Joel's own work. Now these patrons, these portraits, show men holding wine cups, the matzah, the maror, and so on. A prayer book from and excuse me the poor quality of these images, but I couldn't find any better. A prayer book from 1469 was commissioned in Italy by such a patron, who intended it for the use of his daughter, the young lady Maraviglia, and Joel Ben Simeon is the scribe of this manuscript. This not only opens up a lot of questions about women using prayer books, but the fact that the person holding the matzah in this image here shows indeed a young lady, confirms that such figures were meant indeed to represent the patrons and their families. The image that accompanies the halachma initial in the so-called Rothschild Haggadah, one of Joel's early Italian Haggadot, now in Jerusalem, although badly preserved, still offers a close look at a large family seated at a table, lavishly set with golden dishes. All the peoples are well dressed, and the luxurious garment of the woman in the center clearly stands out. It's a quite lavish set table here. Joel represented these patrons time and again on the pages of his Haggadot. Some of his patrons are known by name, others are not, and it has been suggested that the books were produced to be offered to occasional buyers, and we already heard about that. These portraits thus defined a social type rather than specific people, and sketched a particular social circle of Joel's clientele. Different from the wealthy patrons appear the scholars. Numerous scholars are shown on the margins of Joel's manuscripts. This is a common feature in both of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi tradition of Haggadah illustration. They represent the Mishnaic rabbis mentioned in the Haggadah text, the 5 rabbis of Bnei Brak, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Gamliel. Or also, as in this case here, the wise son. These men are usually shown as elderly figures, often with white, long, or gray hair and a beard. Since the second half of the 14th century, they usually appear with their heads covered. Joel adopts these figures in all their variations, and we find numerous scholars in all his Haggadot. They appear either standing or seated, and always with a book in their hands. The book, the typical attribute of the scholar, can be shown often open, often on a lectern, or closed in the man's hands, or as here, that you can see the lectern. It's not on his lap, but he has a little lectern near him. So in this case, this iconography designates the first son, the first of the 4 sons. The medieval Haggadot, each son is characteristic of a particular social type. The wise son is often shown as an elderly man with these attributes of a rabbi. It is significant that this same scholar represents a social type quite distinct from the one that represents the patron who wears particularly lavish and luxurious outfits, whereas the scholar seems to be a bit more humble and dressed in a plain mantle and a simple cap. Joel's love for detail and also his profession as maker of manuscripts is apparent in the rendering of the book shown on the lectern. It lies open. The letters are graphically hinted by small strokes. The clearly visible lines of ruling and the red rubrics at the right of each line, as according to the Hebrew script, are strikingly realistic. The book is given a red binding whose claps are clearly discernible on the left. So this is clearly a bookmaker who has made this picture. The Haggadah describes the third one, the simpleton, as a humble commoner who has no knowledge but is eager to understand. In social terms, he would be an honest but poorly educated member of the middle or lower classes. Jewish artists employed a variety of iconographic features to express these characteristics. He can be shown without a book or with a book with empty pages. Occasionally, he appears together with a person who is apparently attempting to teach him. The simpleton of the Washington Haggadah is the most intriguing of all and has actually no parallel. He's an elderly man with a facial expression distinctly conveying a lack of knowledge. His eyes are wide open and he stares into an open book. He wears a simple, somewhat worn hooded coat. Another example is found in the London Haggadah to your right, where he looks less miserable but simply dressed, eagerly looking into the book. Such figures of the third son represent members of the Jewish society of whom we know significantly less than of wealthy patrons and the intellectual elite. They stand for what in the 14th and 15th century began to be defined as a mostly urban middle class. Craftsmen, merchants, and the like. They were upright and pious members of the Jewish communities who had acquired a trade but lacked religious learning. The mention of slavery and the building of the Egyptian treasure cities in the Haggadah opens up a window on a late medieval building site and its workers. This example is from the London Haggadah. But Joel would look even further aside at the margins of society. The son who does not know to ask appears in almost all of Joel's Haggadot as a jester. Fools and jesters were a regular part of medieval and early modern life. They figure prominently in the iconography of illuminated manuscripts and other visual arts. European monarchs employed jesters for entertainment at their courts. During the Middle Ages, these jokers wore bright, multicolored costumes with a hood extending into donkey's ears and a tail. They carried a long stick, a heavy clap, or a marotte, a short rod with a carved head. Some jesters were natural fools and simple comedians entertaining the folk. Others were smart, funny, and witty and eloquent outsiders employed to amuse the upper classes and members of the court. The borders between these types are not always entirely clear. Hunchbacks and dwarves often filled the role of jesters, physically impaired, but often considered particularly witty and funny. This latter group was often ironic and critical and enjoyed some freedom of speech. Unconventional in their behavior, they were not part of any usual system of hierarchies and norms. The attitude of medieval society to the fool and the jester was somewhat ambivalent. He could be a sinner or an innocent. He could be believed to be close to the devil or close to God. In no way was he bound to conventions and norms. Representing immoral behavior and blasphemy, he also functioned as a critic of those he was supposed to entertain. In the Jewish tradition, as well, questions about fools and unbalanced behavior have no clear-cut answers, and the definition of the line between normal and abnormal behavior is problematic. Christian society occasionally approached the fool as some kind of holy figure through whom God could speak, a notion that was alien to the Jewish tradition. Jesters were not found only at the court. Especially the natural fool as entertainer could be observed in all parts of society and appeared in the towns, at fairs, and at the markets. A sense of how the jester actually figured within the human landscape of Joel's surroundings can be obtained by looking at the Egyptian army in the London Haggadah. Here it is, and here is a detail. On the roof of the carriage at the right edge of the illustration appears a jester beating a drum and blowing a fife, both acts closely associated with the kind of entertainment a jester was supposed to provide. Early modern Italy also witnessed the earliest versions of the Purim-Spiel, a comic theatrical staging of the Book of Esther, involving various types and figures, including jesters. Joel's jester belongs rather to the type of the natural fool or the imbecile, whose unusual behavior may have been perceived as amusing. Perceived as a person lacking wisdom and the ability to acquire knowledge, the popular figure of the jester could easily be employed as a prototype for this character of the fourth son. It is possible that Joel was actually the first artist to invent this iconography, which after 1450 became increasingly popular in Ashkenazi manuscripts of the Haggadah. Joel, of course, was aware of all the attributes attached to the foolish jester. He apparently knew that often the jester or the fool could be considered a blasphemous person of dubious morality, stupid, and overly fond of himself. The hood with the donkey's ears, for example, is linked to this characterization. In a medieval German song, a donkey wished to appear in the disguise of a lion, but its large ears gave it away. Like the fool, the donkey represented blasphemy, lack of knowledge, and immoral conduct. Another common attribute was a mirror, a Spiegel, perhaps the root of the name of one of Germany's most popular jesters, Till Eulenspiegel. Overly fond of himself, the fool looks in the mirror, a mark of pride and blasphemy. In contrast, the witty court jester's association with the mirror was his function as a free-spoken critic. Obvious physical impairment in jesters symbolized as some sort of mirror the not so obviously seen intellectual impairment of the people of the court. The figure in the London Haggadah is not only a jester. He's also a vagabond with ragged, worn-out clothes. He also suffers from goiters, a disease that was closely linked to dwarfism and hunchbacks. Here, he has a big goiter. His expression with the grinning face, looking in the mirror, makes him appear particularly inept. Joel returns to the vagabond at several other occasions. The Haggadah text opens with the following words: "Here is the bread of distress, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let anyone who is hungry come and eat. Let anyone who wishes come and participate in the Passover. Today we are here, next year in the land of Israel. Today we are slaves, next year we shall be free men." Several figures in Joel's repertoire suggest that they are meant to represent those who are hungry, those who are invited to come and eat. In several of Joel's manuscripts, either the third or the fourth son is thus shown as a miserable, poorly dressed figure. In the Parma Haggadah, again one of the early Italian Haggadot, the simpleton wears a short, worn-out, and ragged costume, indicating, and the fact that it's a hooded costume indicates that he wanders around, that he may have no home. A similar figure with bare feet and a ragged hooded garment appears in both the Rothschild and the Washington Haggadah as the man who roasts the Passover lamb. In both images, he's seated on the ground, one hand turning to spit over the fire, no doubt a lengthy and tiresome procedure. In his other hand, he holds a cup of wine, while a bottle appears next to him ready to keep the cup refilled. In the Washington Haggadah, he appears next to the elegantly dressed women busying themselves with the preparation of the Passover meal. They peek somewhat arrogantly at his part of the composition and perhaps, as the gesture of one of the women shows, offers some food. This ragged vagabond seems to represent the homeless and the hungry who is invited to the Seder to come and eat, and was perhaps offered the thankless job of turning the spit with the lamb, or the piece of lamb for the Seder itself. The lamb itself would be a reminiscent of the Passover sacrifice. Sometimes this vagabond is also physically impaired, suffering from goiters, clearly indicated in the area of the neck, and here you have them all. So why this special interest in the goiters as an iconographic element? The goiter is an enlargement of the thyroid gland, usually appearing as a heavy swelling of the neck. The enlargement is due to iodine deficiency in drinking water and salt, typical for alpine areas remote from the sea. The disease is thus specifically associated with alpine populations, and it remained as such until goiter prophylaxis was introduced in alpine areas in the 1920s by means of adding iodine to the drinking water and the salt in these regions. Goiters primarily affected several regions in Switzerland, the Aosta Valley in northern Italy, French Alps, Carinthia, Styria, Bavaria, and even some parts of the Apennines, such as Lombardy, Tuscany, and the Monti Sabini in southern Italy. Ancient and medieval physicians mentioned goiters and ways to treat the disease, and several of them were aware of its regionally determined appearance. To the north of the Alps, the goiters were often associated with monstrosity. They were in fact counted with the so-called fabulous monsters of the East. This perception remained popular until the early 16th century, when humanist chroniclers offered their own observations instead of reproducing earlier views about the monstrous races. In some late medieval sources, finally, the disease was understood as a punishment for sin. There was also a quite rich iconography of goiters in later medieval art, but only in those areas where the goiters were found. So Joel actually could look at quite a rich tradition of this. In line with the perception of the goiters as monstrous, in southern German art, in the Upper Rhine region, for example, the goiters would often signify wickedness. The tortures of Jesus, for example, were occasionally shown that way. In Italy, on the other hand, to the south of the Alps, this was usually not the case. And here, where the goiters were extremely frequent in certain areas, it is a byproduct of early modern realism, often an iconographic sign to evoke empathy with the miserable and the sick. And this is a detail from a tapestry showing a worker, a hard worker, but certainly not a monster. And here we have a woman, this is a picture actually in the Metropolitan Museum, a woman of high rank from Bergamo, which was one of the places where goiters were especially very frequent. A certain difference in mentality can be observed in these approaches to the goiters. The wicked goiters of the north and the realistic Italian representations speak of different mindsets, and the latter seem to be linked to the humanistic worldview that began to govern European consciousness since the early 15th century. Joel and Simeon lived between these two different states of mind. He migrated between the two worlds. Joel and Simeon may have encountered people suffering from the goiters on the great St. Bernard when he moved to northern Italy, and also while living in Lombardy and Tuscany, but most likely not in the Middle Rhine region where he'd grown up. He may indeed have read or heard the view that goiters people are counted among the monsters, or at least that they had limited intelligence. He was certainly also familiar with the iconography. Joel's figures of the goiters are not evil, and they are not grotesque. They're poor and miserable, ignorant and perhaps stupid. Delineated as hungry vagabonds, they are quite likely to have been intended to represent those poor souls invited to partake in the Seder meal. Joel most likely knew that the disease of the goiter was associated with stupidity. He did, however, not share the view of the goiters as wicked or monstrous. In short, these images demonstrate quite eloquently how Joel was nourished from the different cultures he lived in. The wickedness of the second son is defined by his alienness. The wicked one, and I'm quoting the Haggadah, the wicked one, what does he say? What does this right mean to you? To you, and not to him. And since he excludes himself from the community, he's been denied a fundamental belief. He has denied a fundamental belief. You should set his teeth on edge and say to him, it is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. For me, not for him. If he had been there, he would not have been redeemed. The wicked is thus understood as an apostate and is usually shown with iconographic characteristics of a non-Jew. Several Haggadot show him as an overdressed dandy with a halberd, an imagery that perhaps has an Italian origin and was also adopted in the 15th century in some Ashkenazi Haggadot, as here in the so-called Second Nuremberg Haggadah. Jewish costume was usually supposed to be simple and not in any particular way fashionable. Clothing restrictions arose both from the non-Jewish sumptuary laws and from Jewish halakha. The 15th century Ashkenazi scholar Israel ben Petachia Isserlein of Wiener Neustadt banned standified clothing, such as the colorful mi-parti costume, the one you see here, and pointed shoes, which this guy also wears, obviously. In 1404, the Cologne authorities in the Middle Rhine issued a law restricting the forms and fashions of Jewish clothing. What really marks these figures as non-Jews, however, is the halberd they carry. Joel ben Simeon, however, as some other Ashkenazi Haggadot, represents the wicked son as an armed knight. The characterization of the wicked as a knight emphasizes not only alienness, but also aggression. This is also what the dandy's halberd stands for. In some examples, the wicked son is shown in the act of attacking an unarmed victim. The wicked son represents a Gentile aggressor and is a symbol of anti-Jewish persecution. Until the 13th century, the Jews of Ashkenaz carried arms and even occasionally took part in the defense of their towns. The right to protect themselves was later restricted, and the royal protection of Jews, usually regulated in charters given to local authorities, permitting them to allow Jewish dwelling in their vicinities, was linked to the fact that the Jews were not supposed to carry weapons, and this begins in the 13th century. The Jews began to perceive themselves as unprotected victims and to associate the use of arms with Gentile aggression. The iconography of the knight emphasizes this perception of the non-Jew as aggressor. Joel ben Simeon never chose to depict the dandy with the halberd, but always defined the wicked son as a knight, thus characterizing the wicked Gentile in unmistakable forms. Although he spent most of his working life in Italy, where Jewish-Christian relations differed from those in Germany, Joel seems to have carried on with a perception of non-Jews that grew out of his early days across the Alps. Similar knights appear in the crowded mass we have seen before of the Egyptian army, another symbol of anti-Jewish oppression and persecution. The hunting scene in the London Haggadah speaks a similar language. The hunting scene has, in fact, a twofold meaning. First, it is a verbal pun, referring to the abbreviation Yak Nehaz, a common Ashkenazi means to memorize the order of blessings at the beginning of the Seder, in case the Seder falls on a Saturday evening. The blessings are Yud, Yayin, Kuf, Kiddush, Nun, Ner for the Havdalah, Hey, the Havdalah itself, and Zayin, Hazman Hazeh. In the Jewish idiom indebted to the Middle German, this abbreviation sounded like Jagd and Has, hunt the hare. The image would thus offer a memorization aid. By the 15th century, however, the hunter and his dogs had acquired a definitive anti-Christian meaning. Jews did not hunt, and most animals associated with hunting are non-kosher and unfit for consumption. In Jewish eyes, the sport of hunting was first of all associated with the nobility. More important, however, the doe mentioned in the Song of Songs was understood as an allegory of Israel, turning the hunting motive into an allegory of persecution, which later was also adapted to the hare, or attached to the hare. Last, but not least, near the text, go forth and learn, Joel ben Simeon added the figure of a traveler, a verbal pun he may have invented himself, and we have seen it before. This motive appears extremely often in Haggadot. All of the figures in Yoel's Haggadot, this is perhaps the one, of all of the figures in Yoel's Haggadot, this is perhaps the one with whom he most identified. Throughout most of his life, he was on the move. As a child, he first left Cologne. As a young man, he lived for some time in Bonn. Unlike other, especially Christian scribes and artists who maintained organized workshops at permanent locations, some of them establishing printing workshops during the second half of the 15th century, Joel practiced his profession at various places. Prior to his move to Italy, he may have worked along the Rhine Valley and perhaps also further to the east, in Swabia and Moravia. Even after coming to Italy, he apparently did not live at any permanent location for long. His constant being on the road was not necessarily due only to fear of persecution, but rather with the way he chose to practice his craft. Joel reached Italy at some time between 1449 and 1452 when he signed a Merzor in Gemona, in Lombardy. In 1460, he crossed the Alps again. He apparently did not go back to the Middle Rhine, but remained in Ulm, where he joined forces with Meir Yaffe, a local scribe. In 1469, he's back in Italy at some unknown location and signed the mentioned prayer book for Meraviglia. He may also have taken part in the decoration of a mahzor written during the 1470s by a scribe from Cesena in Emilia-Romagna. Down here, in 1476, he may have collaborated in the production of a halachic miscellany in Padua, in the Veneto, up there. 2 years later, in 1478, he was back in the German lands to produce the Washington Haggadah. In 1485, he perhaps can be followed to Modena, the Emilia-Romagna again. In that year, he wrote a copy of David Kimchi's commentary to the Psalter and noted in the colophon that he worked for a patron from that town. The year 1492 found Joel, an old man by now, in Tuscany, where he perhaps contributed to the decoration of a mahzor in Florence, even though his contribution here is disputed. These places, stations in the life of a wandering scribe, are only those mentioned in the surviving colophons, but they give a fairly clear picture of the area he covered during his career. The small images of the young traveler who goes forth and learns may thus very well be associated with Joel himself in some sense, who, having left his native Rhineland, set out for Italy to develop there professionally and seek a well-to-do clientele. To conclude, a man of versatile skills, active in an age of great movement in the book trade, and moving between two cultures, Joel Ben-Simeon must have seen quite a great deal. He was perhaps twice expelled from German towns, from Cologne in 1424 as a young child, and perhaps again from Bonn as a young man. He was still a young man when he set out for Italy. He must have had some sense of the tremendous changes German economic life underwent during those decades. An early 15th century native of the Rhineland, he belonged to a Jewish community which was persecuted in a region where the political and economic situation of the Jews had gradually deteriorated since the 12th century. When he emigrated to Italy, he certainly sensed a change of cultural atmosphere, got a taste of early modern humanism and changing artistic styles, and was able to witness dynamics of close Jewish-Christian relations to a degree that a German Jew would not have been able to witness. Joel began to build up his repertoire of Haggadah motifs early in his career while still in the German lands. Aware of the local tradition of Haggadah illustration, he developed a cycle of which, unfortunately, we have only a scant idea, as the margins of the two books from this period are so badly preserved. On his arrival in Italy, he saw early modern Italian art, echoes of which can be found in his subsequent work. Later, he introduced some of these more recent motifs in Haggadot he made while temporarily working in Germany. The Washington Haggadah demonstrates this process beautifully. Drawn in the quite delicate figure style Joel had acquired during his early years in Italy and displaying several typical Italian motifs, it shows that in anticipation of an Ashkenazi purchase, he now focused on some typical Ashkenazi features, such as the image of Elijah, which we have seen already several times. A short remark about the role this potential owner played in Joel's work is in place here, and we have heard a bit already about it. The fact that the colophon in the Washington Haggadah does not mention a patron by name indicates that the book was not produced to order, but rather that this was intended to be sold on the free market. Now, this is a feature that is increasingly found in late medieval book trade. This seems to be a very minor detail, and you perhaps wonder why we stick to this and bring it up at all. But it is, as a matter of fact, very significant for what went on in the book trade during Joel's lifetime, and this gives us an idea about his professional identity. Whereas for the greater part of the Middle Ages, a wealthy patron, and this is a Christian manuscript from 13th century, a royal commission, wealthy patrons would commonly order lavish manuscripts for their own use, and scribes and artists worked only on commission. The 14th and especially the 15th centuries witnessed significant economic and social developments that tremendously affected the book market, its clientele, and the way books were used. Book production began to change dramatically. The Southern German book trade played a prominent role in these developments, and there can be no doubt that Joel Ben-Simeon was well aware of them. Far-reaching social shifts occurred during that period, and again here's a Christian manuscript from that period, just to demonstrate these changes. Far-reaching social shifts occurred during that period, when an ever-increasing wealthy middle class began to consume cultural goods that had hitherto been confined to the nobility. This educated, erudite, urban middle class grew into an influential clientele for the book trade, which in consequence underwent quite dramatic developments that would ultimately lead to the printing press. Decades before Johannes Gutenberg invented his press in 1455, the makers of books had already begun to adapt to the evolving situation, and among others to produce paper manuscripts of secular literature in the vernacular. This trend led to an entirely different approach to illustration and to the appearance of simple, quickly executed, only partly colored pen drawings, enabling the illustrators to work on greater numbers of copies. Another move towards accelerated book production was the appearance of the woodcut. One of the consequences in this development was the fact that books were no longer exclusively produced to order, but made in several copies for the open market and to be kept in stock. Like their Christian colleagues, Jewish scribes and illustrators were well aware of these possibilities. The colophon of the Washington Haggadah, which lacks the name of a patron, together with the nature of the marginal illustrations, exemplify these tendencies. Joel Ben-Simeon was thus indeed an all-rounder of the book production, a person who represented the trade in all its aspects. He copied books, he vocalized them, he made drawings, he painted them, he moved from place to place, he sought clientele in these ever-changing economic circumstances. A professional who still owned his training to manuscript tradition and who began to think in modern terms and took part in the changes that eventually would lead to the printing press. Thank you.